Breaking news, friends. Military airfields in Crimea, Kacha and Belbek are burning right now. Explosions. There's something going on there. There's an airfield there. Damn. I almost lost my mind. Most of the tactical aviation has been put out of action. That's what the public channels are reporting. Something's burning in the center. We're preparing for the deoccupation of the peninsula. That's what Sky News writes. That's the goal of the military operations. Drones attacked the Azot plant in Perm and the Orsknefteorgsintez plant in the Orenburg region of Russia. Ukraine may be supplied with long-range Tomahawk and Barracuda missiles. And with their help, not only frontline targets are now under threat, but also key military objectives deep inside Russia. Moscow, St. Petersburg, get ready. Truly large-scale blackouts, fuel shortages, and a harsh winter await the racists.
The cockles have struck. There's no electricity here at all.
At the same time, the attacked refineries have already put more than 40% of Russia's oil refining capacity out of commission, with losses estimated at $100 billion. Yeah, fucking oil depot, damn it! Russia is essentially experiencing an energy and fuel crisis. Let's discuss the details with the well-known military analyst, Roman Svetan. Roman Grigorievich, welcome.
Thank you. I wish everyone good health.
Roman Grigorievich, let's start with the occupied Crimea. So first of all, there is information from Sky News that the armed forces of Ukraine are preparing brilliant special operations under the occupation of the peninsula. This article came out today. I read it. And right away, military airfields in Crimea are burning, Kacha and Belbek. They report strikes, saying both the long-range Neptune and drones are being used. What do you think?
Regarding the deoccupation of Crimea, we've been saying for several years that the most optimal option for us is to begin the deoccupation of our territory precisely with Crimea. Crimea is an operational geographic cauldron squeezed between two seas, the Azov and the Black Sea. The entry and exit are under our control. If the Kerch Bridge is destroyed, then basically the only way to get into Crimea would be either by sea, which is very problematic, or via land crossings that are completely under our control, because the range there is about 100 kilometers and we can reach it from both sides. We have the means to reach it. In other words, Crimea itself is practically begging to be deoccupied, and what's most interesting is that this could happen without ground operations, without land or sea operations, meaning no amphibious assault, no losses. We can deoccupy it by destroying or driving out, pushing out the Russian troops. That is what deoccupation means. Long-range strike weapons are the consequence, but they need to be available in sufficient quantity. The main component is aviation, which in this millennium is used to carry out combat missions. It is precisely this that will allow us to drive out the Russian troops, to destroy them depending on their willingness to die. Let's put it that way. It's not for nothing that we've been telling the Russians for several years now that they need to learn how to leave Crimea using the crawl, breaststroke, or even dog paddle. How long has it been now? We've been talking about this with you for about 3 years. Well, it's definitely the 4th year now. So now we have this opportunity and the actions of our special services to destroy the enemy's air defense systems. This is what shows that preparations are underway for a serious attack on Crimea. And it's pretty much like this. Without geopolitics or politics, it's purely a technical matter. Just like how Mossad, or rather the Israeli IDF, struck Iran. Again, I repeat, without geopolitics, it's purely a technical mechanism. They took out the Iranian air defense, and after that, from 1,000 kilometers away, well, for us, it's only 300, they had to refuel their aircraft, but we don't need to refuel. They entered Iranian territory just like we can enter the airspace with our aircraft, the airspace over Crimea, and then use free-falling high-precision aerial bombs and accurately guided missiles to take out targets. Ground targets, just as was done, for example, to Iranian military sites after achieving air superiority 1,000 kilometers away from your bases and airfields. So it's essentially a one-to-one operation. There's no need to invent anything new. Everything was already thought up 100 years ago at the dawn of aviation. This is the kind of mechanism that could be used in the event of the occupation of Crimea. The Iranians, after all, are primarily a land-based country, and therefore there is no shared border with Israel, so there was no ground operation. And in principle, it wasn't necessary. We have the same situation, but for us, it's much simpler. The Russians will have to flee because Crimea, I repeat once again, is an operational geographic cauldron. They will have to run from there or simply perish. Everything will depend on the amount of strike assets available. Today, strikes were carried out on Belbek and Kacha, which are western airfields. The Russians have 5 such airfields that they use in Crimea. 5. 2 of them have already been hit more than once. Why? Because it is these airfields that the Russians use to deploy their surface-to-air missile systems and radar units of the radio-technical troops. In other words, the eyes of the Russian air defense begin here. The first eye, roughly speaking, is Kacha. The last eye is the Kerch Bridge, so if you stretch it out, that's roughly how it looks. That's why the strikes on Kacha, on Belbek, and on the series of nearby airfields are the beginning of achieving air superiority, which will now be carried out by our special services, special operations forces, unmanned systems forces, in other words, the defense forces of Ukraine. When the actual air attack on Crimea happens, it will have to involve missiles, specifically fairly maneuverable missiles. They won't work very well for us, and not just the long-range ones. The Neptune has a range of 280 kilometers. It can reach at least the middle of Crimea, and depending on the launch point, almost as far as Kerch. This is the so-called basic Neptune, which we have in sufficient quantity, coastal missile system. This is our missile, which has been in service for more than a year, since 2018, and is carrying out combat missions. The long-range Neptune is possible, meaning with a slightly greater range, it could reach up to 1,000 kilometers into the Caucasus. That's if we target that direction. Aviation components. We already have a 2nd brigade receiving F-16S. 2 brigades of F-16S are enough to carry out a military operation, an air operation that is using aerial strike assets, missile and bomb attacks, without ground or naval operations. So let's wait. That is when the aircraft arrive along with the aircraft. It's a platform. We need a sufficient amount of weaponry to carry out such an attack, because as soon as we're ready, the main thing is that the Russians are ready. I'll say it again, freestyle, breaststroke, even dog pedal.
Roman Grigorievich, for some reason, Sky News wrote that before winter, Ukraine might launch a large-scale attack on Crimea. This could be, quote, either a naval landing by Ukrainian forces or a massive attack on the Kerch Bridge. What do you think?
Well, I would argue about the naval part. Why? A naval landing is possible in 3 locations, realistically, in order to accomplish a specific task, and based on the capabilities we have. It's not Crimea. It's the it's the Kinburn Spit, the Tendrov Spit, and Skadovsk, the port of Skadovsk. But these are still the shores of southern Black Sea Ukraine. In other words, it's the mainland coast, basically the left bank of the Dnipro. In principle, for any amphibious landing, the objective of any landing operation, not just amphibious, but also airborne ground, any kind of landing, is to carry out a rapid advance by various means, seize and hold a bridgehead until the main forces arrive. As for Crimea, if you try to land an amphibious force there, that's basically a suicide mission. So obviously no one is going to do that, because ground forces definitely won't be able to approach, since it would still take another 6 months to a year of using airstrikes to deal with Crimea. But for example, the Kinburn Spit, the Tendrov Spit, and Skadovsk, that's a port, by the way, just 50 kilometers from Crimea. That is to carry out the combat mission of an amphibious landing, say, at the port of Skadovsk, and hold it until the main forces arrive, which, let's say, cross the Dnipro from Kherson, not from Oleshki, and basically by the direct road. There's a straight road through Hola Pristan. They'll reach Skadovsk, cut off this triangle almost along the left bank of the Dnipro, and it would be possible to hold it. So in this scenario, such an opportunity exists. Yes, this is the direction toward Crimea, but it's not Crimea itself. That's why when it comes to a naval landing, our partners, the journalists, were a bit hasty, to put it mildly. But the Kerch Bridge, its liberation needs to begin. Why the Kerch Bridge? Because it's precisely that logistical chain through which 30% of military ammunition and equipment passes through Crimea to Kherson and to the Zaporizhzhia and Kherson fronts. It's clear that we need to cut it off first and foremost. The downside is that it's difficult to do. Why? Because of the numerous and uneven defense systems, almost all our missiles, all our efforts are intercepted. It needs to be taken down with ballistic missiles. There should be enough HROM missiles, several dozen of them. HROM 1, HROM 2, it doesn't matter. Depending on the range, 300 kilometers is basically possible. That's the only way to break through and overwhelm the Russian air defense, specifically over Moscow and over the Kerch Bridge.
Roman Gorko, when we're talking about the military airfields Kacha and Belbek, is the enemy's tactical aviation currently stationed there? In what numbers? Because you and I don't know, we discuss strikes on Kacha and Belbek almost twice a month. This happens regularly.
These two airfields are used as forward operating bases, meaning they host tactical aviation, mainly the Russian Federation's naval aviation, and there are always army aviation helicopters stationed there. Helicopters, yes, which are used to counter our surface and aerial drones. So helicopters can operate up to an altitude of 1 kilometer. By the way, this is actually the only, well, not the only, but one of the main means of destruction that the Russian Federation uses against our drones, including aerial drones. They simply have a lot of helicopters, and the entire range of their helicopter fleet is army aviation. And so at forward airfields like Belbek and especially Kacha, they are stationed there. They have reloading and refueling points there. In other words, a whole process is set up. They're not the main bases, but as forward airfields, they fulfill their purpose.
Roman Grigorievich, now regarding the strikes on oil refineries and other targets. We attacked the Azot plant in Perm, Crimea'S in Orenburg Oblast. What do you think?
Well, now we know where the Russian orcs come from Ork. Yes, from there. Our specialists have highlighted it. This is where the orc lair is located. That is somewhere around there. But seriously, of course, we've talked about this before, and in principle, our listeners should be prepared for it. The next stage in destroying the Russian economy is through the destruction of the Russian chemical industry, meaning the oil and gas sector. Not just one, but practically all of Russian chemistry. Well, the kind that mainly uses gas is tied to the oil and gas sector. So why are they now targeting chemical production, for example? And our drones are even flying as far as 1,500 kilometers. But the main goal, first of all, is to try to completely destroy this plant. That possibility exists. For example, the plant that was hit, the Perm plant, in addition to producing ammonia and so on, it also produced ammonium nitrate. Ammonium nitrate is used in the production of explosives and in large quantities. For us, it's very important to take the chemical industry out of the equation for this task to prevent Russian, let's say, powder plants from producing explosives. So ammonium nitrate, among other things, also explodes very well. If anyone remembers a few years ago in Lebanon, in Beirut, there was an explosion of ammonium nitrate, Russian, by the way. A Russian ship had docked there at the time, either standing or unloading, and then suddenly it exploded, as they say. So this kind of sudden explosion can be organized at any chemical plant that produces ammonium nitrate. That is, and this Perm plant was producing it. Well, and the Orsk plant, that's basically, you could say, an oil refinery. Mainly it produces gasoline, diesel, and aviation kerosene. This Orsk plant is very important for us. And the next one after it, if you go further east, about 3,000 kilometers, the Orsk plant, the refinery, that is the oil refinery, so that's the Orsk one. From there, the Orsk people, that's Orsk, right? And then further on under Kazakhstan, yes, that's Omsk. So in Omsk, there is an oil refinery, the largest in Russia, processing 21 million tons per year. That means it's serious money, and it's essential to reach it and stop this oil refining. Yes, they do process some Kazakh oil there, but still the money comes from the refining, so it's necessary to get to it. Well, if they've managed to reach Orsk, I think they'll make it to Omsk as well.
Roman Grigorievich. So, according to the raw statistics, the oil refineries that were attacked have already taken more than 40% of Russia's refining capacity offline, according to analysts. And the losses are estimated at over 100 billion. But when I speak with economists, they look at me and say, Putin couldn't care less. The population can queue for gasoline. The lines can be colossal. A fuel and energy crisis. They'll get through it. It won't in any way affect Russia's ability to wage war against Ukraine? Roman Grigorievich, I'd like to discuss this with you.
Well, through pressure on Russian civil society, it definitely won't have any effect. And Putin truly doesn't give a damn. But our goal isn't to pressure Russian society. We've discussed this more than once. It's a side effect, so to speak. A side effect of what? Of the fact that the bulk of the fuel that is still being produced at other plants goes to the army. In other words, to put it crudely, so you understand the process, if a tank driver and a tractor driver are fighting over diesel fuel, the tank driver will win. I'll give you 3 guesses why. The tank has a cannon, right? And the tractor driver, at best, has a rude gesture in his pocket. Therefore, naturally, the tractor drivers are left without fuel. But the tank drivers are carrying out a combat mission. Putin understands this perfectly. So he, in principle, doesn't pay any attention. And not just Putin, this whole Russian military clique. They pay absolutely no attention to what civilian vehicles will run on. It's a significant side effect. It's essentially turning a gas station into a large parking lot, right? And that's precisely it, into an impound lot, effectively, meaning all the civilian cars will stop, but that won't affect the military at all. To truly impact the fuel supply to the army, you need to completely destroy not just 40%, but the entire oil refining industry of Russia. Plus, you absolutely have to destroy the flow of foreign currency. And that's why we're hitting the chemical industry next. The next, as we discussed, expect further strikes on the chemical industry. And there they are, the strikes on the chemical industry. Let's make a prediction. The next strikes will be on metallurgy and on Russia's energy sector, because the next stage is precisely the destruction of metallurgy, which provides a significant amount of funds to the Russian treasury. And of course, the energy sector that powers the military-industrial complex of the Russian Federation. Those strikes are a certainty, 100%. That's the third stage. So to prevent the Russian army from being able to refuel, you have to take down the entire oil and gas industry of Russia. Plus, you have to take down the flow of that currency, petrodollars included, so that they can't buy it like they're doing now. They've already started buying diesel and gasoline from abroad, so to speak, from the Chinese. They're trying to buy from the Indians fuel that's been refined from someone else's oil. In other words, to bring it back in. So, and you have to completely, in order to stop the Russian army, you have to completely zero out the Russian economy. So there's no money to buy even this gasoline and diesel. After that, they'll switch, as we've already discussed, to donkeys who are now bleating and braying, but don't want to go to war. The asses go, but the donkeys don't. By asses, I mean these Russian federalists, but the donkeys are done for. Right now, a donkey costs more than a motorcycle. Why are Russian bloggers and public pages now practically flooded with offers to buy a motorcycle for the Russian soldiers? Well, that's about what it costs. A bottle of water and a motorcycle, especially in Donbas where there's no water at all. It's unclear what they're pouring into those bottles. So this process is ongoing. And to stop it completely, to stop the Russian army, you have to cut off these two flows. That is fuel production, and foreign currency. Without foreign currency, that is, without stopping the flow of foreign currency, well, stopping the army will be very difficult.
Dear viewers, please like this video, support our content with Roman Grigorievich. Every one of your likes is priceless, and in the comments, please write your viewing location where you're watching us from. Roman Grigorievich, look. President Zelensky, I believe the day before yesterday, said that if until now we have attacked Russia exclusively with Ukrainian armaments, with Ukrainian weapons, then now the situation may change, said Zelensky. And then two pieces of news appear. First, the US is providing Ukraine with intelligence data for missile strikes deep inside Russia. This means oil refineries, pipelines, power plants, and other facilities, including in Moscow and St. Petersburg. This is the first time the US will be helping Ukraine carry out strikes using long-range missiles on targets deep within Russian territory. And the second piece of information is that the possibility of supplying Ukraine with long-range Tomahawk and Barracuda missiles is now being considered. Roman Grigorievich, how can you comment on this?
Well, we know perfectly well where the Russian power plants, pumping stations, and pipelines are located. They're all leftovers from the Soviet Union. It's very important for us to have the location of Russian air defense systems in real time. That's what the Americans can share with us so that our drones can get through. A drone flies, let's put it simply. How long did the drone fly to Orsk, right? It's almost 1,500 kilometers at a speed of 150 kilometers per hour for 10 hours. So in 10 hours, it can be shot down 300 times, and it must have a flight path that bypasses all the kill zones and control zones of Russian air defenses, of which in principle there aren't many left if the drone has passed the frontal air defenses. But you need to know them precisely, specifically, what kind of air defense, at what altitude the beam already engages, how to bypass it, at what speeds, at what altitudes to fly under the beam, that is under the radio horizon. It's a whole process. And without that level of intelligence data, and the Americans see it all. They have everything from signals intelligence to satellite control. They see everything perfectly. Which Russian station has been activated, what its detection range is, and so on. And this data gives us the opportunity for even our own weapons to get through and complete their combat mission. Well, we've already talked about Orsk, we've talked about Perm, meaning we reached them. Now, about the missiles, well, I don't believe they'll give us Tomahawks. I don't believe it for one simple reason. If they were ready to give us Tomahawks, they would have already given us JASSMs for the F-16s we have or ATACMS for the HIMARS we have. So in other words, it's mostly just talk. Technically, it's possible. It's not that it's impossible, right? It is indeed a sea-launched missile at this stage. But a few years ago, a program was launched to restore ground-based mobile launches, so to speak. A sufficient number of launches have already been created. Typhoon or Typhon, as they're also called, depending on the translation. Typhoon or Typhon. These launches make it possible to fire, that is to launch a Tomahawk missile from this platform. It's the same, in principle, it's the same silo from the ship-based Mk-41 launcher. They just took it off and mounted it on a vehicle chassis, and then it can carry out a combat mission. But I'll say it again, why don't I believe it at this stage? Because, well, they would have already given us JASSMs. We already have a second brigade of F-16s, not a single JASSM. A cruise missile, by the way, with a shorter range. This issue could have been resolved. They're afraid. So if they're afraid to give us JASSMs, do you really think they'll give us Tomahawks? But something on the level of, say, the Barracuda, well, it's not exactly, you could call it a drone missile. Roman, you said it wasn't a Barracuda. Yes, I'm talking about the Barracuda. A Tomahawk is, after all, a cruise missile, right? Medium range. Its range is around 2,000 kilometers, plus or minus 500, depending on the specific model. But the Barracuda has a 500-kilometer range. However, it can still carry a 500-kilogram warhead. So it's a missile, by and large, you could say short range. Well, the Barracuda is roughly the same as a Taurus. Only a Taurus costs millions of euros, while a Barracuda costs a few $100,000. It's simpler, it's easy to produce, meaning in large quantities, like our Palyanitzia, for example, or the Flamingos. True, we only hear about them in little videos and announcements. But in reality, for example, the Barracuda is now entering production, and in 6 months we could receive it, but we won't get it tomorrow. It's only just entering production. We'll probably get ER JASSMs faster. That is, there's a missile that, in principle, they've already started producing for us, and we can get them faster. Because we are waiting, of course, for the weapons that we ordered, but it is much simpler. I have already explained it in detail to give what we have. Launches, there are HIMARS, there are 50 HIMARS, ATACMS. Please, the rocket could already work at 300 kilometers. There are F-16s, already several squadrons that carry out combat missions, but what level of combat mission? With fly swatters, they chase flies, that is with guns, roughly speaking, with mortars or there for geraniums. Therefore, if they are given the opportunity to at least 100 jazz musicians in order to work out the range, 500 kilometers, the same 500 kilometers, the same 500 kilograms of warhead, and there will be no Moscow. What a blackout, they say. Imagine what a blackout is like in Moscow. There is a blackout in Kyiv. It's okay. What was it like in Kyiv? Why is it okay? Firstly, the population density is not as high. Some have left. Secondly, we are already accustomed. We are already prepared. We know how to solve these issues, life support, but Kyiv is still several times smaller in population than Moscow. Just imagine, several tens of millions. No one knows how many mouths there are in Moscow. Just imagine how many asses there are in Moscow if they all go to the toilet at once during the day and there is no water. There will be no color there. There will be, to put it mildly, a Russian spirit, which will then seriously smell in a radius of about 1,500 before it reaches us. Well, yes. The Urals are somehow certain, that is, there will simply be a humanitarian catastrophe, and such a thing is now one of the mechanisms, by the way, how to kill all combat mosquitoes. They simply sigh from this Russian spirit. There will be a problem, and such an opportunity exists. If we were given these jazz musicians, even 100 of them, that Russian spirit would have reached the Urals.
Roman Grigorievich, it's just that when Zelensky says that previously we only used Ukrainian long-range weapons, but now we don't. I wonder what he's talking about. What long-range missiles? This is European? What is President Zelensky talking about? So what non-Ukrainian thing can fly far into Russian territory?
Well, what is he talking about? Millions of people, Ukrainians at least, have been asking this question for several years now. That's why it's very difficult for me to decipher it, so to speak. But in reality, let's say, from what we can have at this stage, I have already named it in principle. We have a platform. So what can fly quickly? They can. Those who have already flown, 300 kilometers. Well, what is 300 kilometers? Look here. The 300-kilometer Atacama will reach Kursk, Bryansk, Voronezh, Belgorod, and Rostov. These are 5 regional cities along the cross-border, that is transfrontal cross-border cities. This is not to mention Crimea and Russian cities. So only ATACMS can reach that far. If we get PRSMs, by the way, the Americans are now switching to PRSMs. It's the same launcher for HIMARS, but it holds 2 missiles, not one ATACMS. There are 2 PRSM missiles in the block. It has a 500-kilometer range. It can reach Moscow. So how do you create a blackout in Moscow? It's very simple. About 100 PRSMs, and there will definitely be a blackout. And that's not even mentioning JASMs, or rather, excuse me, yes, JASMs, which could be dropped from the same F-16s. So that's what could, of course, really help us, not to mention Scalps, Storm Shadows, or, for example, Tauruses. But there's a lot to say about Tauruses. The issue now is, well, for example, none of our current aircraft can carry Tauruses, and F-16s can't either. The Gripen can carry them. That's why I don't rule out the possibility that incoming Gripens, even a couple of aircraft, well, they usually transfer a flight of 4 aircraft, could mean we get Tauruses. That's also the same 500 kilometers, in other words, Moscow again. So we wait, and maybe then we'll understand what our great leaders are talking about.
As you always say, hello, Moscow bathhouses.
Roman Grigorievich, absolutely.
All right, let's talk about the drones over the European Union and NATO countries. So 15 drones were detected for the first time at night in Belgium over a military base. The airports were shut down. Then drones appeared in Munich. Everyone was shocked. Civil aviation, the airports temporarily suspended their operations. The cover plan was activated. Next at Valdai, Putin is asked, well, as they say, Vladimir Vladimirovich, how many drones are you going to launch? He says, there will be many, but you understand it's not us. It's just some guys having fun. And so, in essence, Putin announced that a huge number of drones will be roaming the skies of the North Atlantic Alliance countries. Roman Grigorievich, from a military perspective, what does this indicate?
Well, regarding Belgium, for example, there's likely some pressure, more of an economic nature. Why? Because Belgium is where Nabulina's main reserves are held, right? Those securities that she placed there, around 200 billion euros. She's our person specifically. We've already talked about Nabulina. What kind of Tatar is she? She's a pure-blooded Ukrainian. That's how much she must have wanted to help us. That's one thing. So that's likely one of the reasons why they're flying over Belgium. The purely military reason is that Belgium hosts a base where American nuclear weapons are located. Several NATO countries, well, rather in NATO, there are several countries that have their own nuclear weapons, France, Britain, and the United States. And American nuclear weapons, about 150 nuclear warheads, are located in 5 other countries. In Belgium, the Netherlands, Germany, Italy, and Turkey. And so in Belgium, naturally, there is a base, and that's why the Russians, of course, will now try, at the very least, to find some approaches to these bases as well. These drone flights are not so harmless. Not so harmless. This isn't a provocation. This is already combat. This is the execution of a combat mission. What do the drones do? They create a so-called digital map of the terrain, approaching specific targets and starting to photograph them, converting them into a digital image that can then be uploaded into the missiles, into the head, into the missile's onboard memory. Now, who has heard of machine memory? Well, it's precisely these photographs, which are first taken by those same drones, then uploaded, and the missile on its terminal trajectory phase when it's approaching the target. And let's say electronic warfare systems try to affect it, to cut it off from control and communication with the satellite. Well, it no longer needs a satellite connection if it has machine vision, meaning it's a bunch of photographs that it uses to simply approach the target. But they need to be taken from the air, from specific angles. That's what these drones are doing. That's why, frankly, I don't understand why they aren't shooting them down. This is preparation for serious strikes, for specific strikes with weapons that the Russians possess. Well, if we have them, we have the Neptune. For those who don't know, well, this information is publicly available. It also approaches the target using precisely this kind of machine vision. That's why electronic warfare systems are practically ineffective against it. Kudos to the Luch Design Bureau. They immediately, even before, why, for instance, fight against EW? What for? If you can just disconnect from the satellite and carry out the combat mission in this exact way. It's just a different approach, different frequencies, wavelengths that are used, a different set of these digital photos. But nevertheless, the principle is roughly the same. So to the Europeans, shoot down everything that buzzes, especially over military facilities. Otherwise, something will buzz later that will cause a world of trouble.
Friends, please like this video and in the comments, write a few kind words in support of our tandem. Roman Grigorievich and I meet 3 times a week to discuss key military and political topics. Roman Grigorievich is our military analyst, sometimes a psychologist, sometimes a psychiatrist when he assesses the actions of the Rushists and Putin, but we always provide clear analysis. The renowned military analyst Roman Svitan. Roman Grigorievich, thank you very much. And as is tradition, we'll see you on Monday.
Goodbye.